Hello. This channel is an audiobook channel where we read and reflect together on little books created by hand. In an age when massive steel bombers ruled the skies over Europe, what drove the German army into its deepest terror was, unexpectedly, an old wooden biplane. Young female pilots who would cut their engines, glide silently through the darkness, and descend over enemy positions to drop their bombs. The Germans, shaken by that eerie silence and sudden ambush, called them the Night Witches. But behind that name were not witches from legend. They were ordinary yet extraordinarily brave young women who chose to fly into the most dangerous night skies to defend their homeland. Today's book, Night Witches, the wooden aircraft that cut through the sky. I will begin now. The winter nights of the Eastern Front in 1943 showed no mercy. In the bone-cutting cold, with temperatures plunging far below -20 degrees Celsius, German soldiers holding the plains of the Caucasus and Eastern Europe crouched inside frozen mud trenches, staring anxiously into the night sky. There was no thunderous roar from the mighty Junkers or Heinkel bombers, the kings of the European skies. The front was filled only with the sound of the bitter wind, and then, at that very moment, a strange and chilling silence descended from above. Then, slicing through that heavy stillness, came an unfamiliar sound. Whoosh! Shh! It sounded like an invisible, giant broom sweeping roughly through the air or the cold scythe of death cutting through the wind. The moment that faint, yet deadly sound tore across the night air, the faces of the German soldiers on the ground drained of color. Urgent warning shouts burst upward. Dozens of anti-aircraft searchlights turned on violently and began tearing through the darkness. 88mm anti-aircraft guns and quadruple-mounted machine guns erupted in furious fire. But it was already too late. A blunt silhouette had slipped down through the darkness like a ghost, soundless, and rained destruction upon the earth. Massive explosions shook the ground in rapid succession, and carefully concealed supply lines, ammunition depots, and field headquarters barracks were swallowed in flame in an instant. Only after dropping its bombs did the shadow suddenly burst into a rough, rattling engine roar, then vanish leisurely back into the darkness of the night sky as though mocking the chaos below. The operational logs of German field commanders began to fill with lines soaked in suppressed fear and frayed nerves. Every night, Russian women pilots harass us without cease. They come in silence, and we cannot sleep for even a single breath. The Germans gave these terrifying visitors who ruled the night sky a cursed name, one filled with contempt and dread: Nachthexen. Literally translated, it meant night witches. But the women flying above were not witches riding broomsticks. They were young female soldiers, many in their late teens or early 20s, who threw themselves willingly into the pitch-black sky and to the threshold of death in order to drive invaders from their homeland while flying old wooden training aircraft. In June 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union with merciless force, opening the most horrific theater of war in human history, the German-Soviet War, known as Operation Barbarossa. Taken by surprise, the Red Army collapsed helplessly and was pushed back to the very gates of Moscow. The fate of the homeland trembled like a candle in the wind. As male pilots were being shot down day after day and the situation in the sky worsened to the point of crisis, Major Marina Raskova, the legendary female Soviet aviator and national hero, directly persuaded Stalin himself to authorize something unprecedented in military history: the creation of regular combat aviation units composed entirely of women. In October 1941, at the small military training base of Engels, swept by the cold winds near the Volga River, hundreds of young women gathered, honor students from Moscow State University, diligent factory workers from textile mills, enthusiastic members of civilian flying clubs. Their backgrounds varied, but the goal in their hearts was one and the same: to defend their homeland and their families from invasion. Among them was Nadezhda Popova, who would later become the most legendary symbol of the Night Witches and set one of the unit's greatest records. She too had submitted her application to this brutal front line driven by one burning desire: to fly and strike the enemy. At the time, the military was a rigidly closed, male-dominated world. Male commanders at the front openly sneered, saying, "If you're going to hand airplanes to women, you might as well draft them into the infantry." Naturally, no supplies designed for female soldiers were issued. The girls were handed men's tunics and trousers twice their size and had to pick up needle and thread to alter them by hand. Since there were no boots in their size, they stuffed large men's boots with torn scraps of old newspaper to fill the empty space. Their long hair was cut short according to regulations, but they did not complain, not once. Every day brought more than 14 hours of intense flight training, military drills, and classes in navigation and geometry. Through a brutal selection process, 3 aviation regiments were created, staffed entirely by women, not only as pilots and navigators, but also as mechanics and armorers. Among them, the unit that would take on the most dangerous and grueling night operations and carve its name into the history of darkness was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the unit that would later terrify the Eastern Front as the Night Witches. Under the steady and formidable command of Captain Yevdokia Bershenskaya, this regiment would serve on the front lines throughout the war without wavering once. When the 588th Regiment was formed with such fierce determination, the aircraft they were given were not the cutting-edge Yak fighters or Il-2 Sturmovik attack aircraft that dominated the skies of the era. The airplane assigned to them was the Polikarpov Po-2. It had first flown in 1928 and was mainly used for crop dusting or as a basic training plane in flight schools. It was an old, unimpressive wooden biplane. To call the PO-2 a weapon of modern war would have been generous. Instead of a steel frame, its skeleton was built from pine. Instead of aluminum alloy skin, it was covered with stretched fabric, treated and glued over the frame. Even with the engine pushed to its limit, its top speed struggled to exceed 150 kilometers per hour, slower than the landing speed of some German fighters of the time. There was not a single armored plate to protect the pilots from enemy fire. There was no radar for night flying, and often not even a proper radio for communication. In the early part of the war, pilots were not even issued emergency parachutes, supposedly to reduce weight. A single graze from tracer rounds or machine gun fire could rip the fabric and set the entire aircraft ablaze in moments. It was, quite literally, a flying coffin. The cockpit was hell itself. The Po-2 had a completely open 2-seat cockpit with no canopy. In the front seat sat the pilot controlling the aircraft. In the rear sat the navigator, who also served as the bombardier, calculating the route and the moment of bomb release. Once airborne over the winter nights of the Eastern Front, where temperatures often plunged to minus 20 or 30 degrees Celsius, knife-like winds slammed mercilessly into the cockpit. Even with thick leather jackets and flight caps, the cold seeped into their bones. Frost formed white on the pilot's eyelashes and wind goggles. Because there was no radio, the navigator had to tap the pilot's shoulder or push against her back with a foot to send signals while searching for the target in the blackness. Their bombing method was also primitive, little better than something from the First World War. Their entire bomb load consisted of 50-kilogram or 100-kilogram bombs, awkwardly hung from simple racks beneath the fuselage or lower wings, carrying at most around 300 kilograms per sortie. There was, of course, no precision mechanical bomb sight. The navigator in the rear seat had to lean her upper body out into the savage wind, searching for the dark ground and the faint outline of the target with the naked eye alone. Then, in the split second when the target passed beneath the aircraft, she would shout, "Drop now, Sbross!" at the top of her lungs, and the pilot would yank the crude mechanical lever at her side. The release hook connected by wire would snap open, and the bombs would fall by gravity alone. Everything depended on human instinct and raw timing. It was a desperate duel, fought almost by feel. To survive in such a fragile wooden aircraft, riddled with fatal weaknesses, Bershanskaya and her women devised a strategy as daring as it was ingenious: glide bombing. When the night's mission began, a Po-2 carrying Nadezhda Popova and her close navigator, Yekaterina Ryabova, would take off into the darkness. Once they reached the skies above enemy territory with the aircraft's characteristic noisy rattling engine, Popova would boldly cut the throttle and shut the engine down completely while still some distance from the target. The moment the lively propeller stopped spinning, the world seemed to fall into the silence of the dead. With the engine's roar gone, only the faint scraping sound of the taut canvas wings slicing through the freezing night air remained. The aircraft, in complete darkness, drifted downward like a soundless ghost, gradually losing altitude as it glided above the enemy. The German sentries below, unable to hear any engine, remained unaware and off guard. Then, as the Po-2 slipped in low, the bombs began to fall. By the time the enormous explosion shook the ground and the screams of startled soldiers filled the air, the searchlights were already switching on in panic, sweeping wildly through the sky. But just before the columns of light could catch the aircraft, Popova would desperately restart the engine. With a coughing burst of ignition and black smoke spilling from the motor, the plane would claw back upward and turn into the darkness. This ambush tactic of silent gliding inflicted not only physical destruction, but a level of psychological terror on the Germans far beyond imagination. Frontline soldiers lay awake through the night, tormented by the thought that the witches might descend at any moment and cut off their last breath. Driven into neurosis, German troops fired illumination rounds uselessly into the sky and sprayed machine gun fire into the empty darkness. The appearance of the witches was not just a blow against bridges and supply lines, it was a vast psychological weapon that gnawed at the minds of Nazi soldiers and crushed their morale to the ground. Ironically, the Po-2's most fatal weakness, its slowness, became one of its greatest tools for survival. The latest German Luftwaffe fighters patrolling the night skies, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, were too fast and too heavy. When they tried to slow down enough to stay on the tail of a Po-2, they often approached the edge of stall. More than once, a modern steel Predator nearly lost lift and dropped from the sky trying to match the speed of an old wooden bird. This absurd spectacle, advanced fighters driven mad by the very slowness of the aircraft they hunted, infuriated German command. Rumors even spread across the front that anyone who shot down even a single one of these cursed night witches would be awarded the Iron Cross immediately. From the Caucasus Mountains to the Kuban along the Black Sea, through Crimea, Belarus, and into Poland, as the front slowly pushed westward, the everyday reality faced by the night witches bore no resemblance to romance or glory. Their missions were not one-time flights. They were on a different level entirely from ordinary air units, where one pilot might fly once in a night and then rest. On one brutal winter night on the Polish front, as the war approached its peak, Nadezhda Popova and navigator Katya Ryabova faced a trial that pushed human physical and mental endurance to its absolute edge. As soon as dusk fell, they took off under cover of darkness, bombed a German ammunition depot, and returned to base. The moment the aircraft touched the frozen dirt runway, before they had time even to catch their breath, young female ground crew and armorers, many of them teenage girls, swarmed the plane like bees. With bare hands, because proper gloves were scarce, they lifted freezing iron bombs and fastened them beneath the aircraft. Heavy fuel cans were rolled forward and emptied into the tank. Before Popova could even warm her frozen hands with her breath inside the cockpit, the runway controller's red flashlight was already signaling takeoff again. Back into the sky. Back into endless darkness. Back into enemy territory where death reigned upward. That night, Popova and Ryabova repeated this madness 18 times. 18 precarious takeoffs. 18 penetrations of enemy air defenses. 18 precision drops. 18 returns with their lives on the line. By dawn, when Popova finally dragged herself out of the cockpit after the last mission, her body was stiff as a log from exhaustion and tension. Smoke had stained around her eyes, and deep dark circles hung beneath them like metals. Despite chronic lack of sleep, flesh-cutting cold, and the constant terror that anti-aircraft fire might blow them apart at any moment, the women of the 588th Regiment loaded bombs and flew again and again, 6 to 8 sorties a night, driven by one conviction alone: to save their homeland. Among all of them, Popova's astonishing 18 sorties in a single night on the Polish front became a legendary personal record, unmatched even among the night witches themselves. Behind the iron-willed record of 18 sorties in a single night, another dreadful mission remained etched in Popova's memory. A night when she came closer to death than ever before. On a pitch-black night, while the front stood locked in tension, Popova's Po-2 entered enemy territory, descended, and cut its engine for a glide-bombing approach. Then came disaster. As the clouds parted and moonlight spilled through, the aircraft was caught squarely in the beam of the most powerful German anti-aircraft searchlight, the Master Searchlight, its bluish beam locking onto the target. It was the hopeless moment when a ghost of darkness was stripped naked under a merciless spotlight. The German positions below erupted as though in celebration. Then the anti-aircraft barrage began. Thousands of tracer rounds rose from gun positions all around, drawing red lines across the sky as they tore into the wooden aircraft. At Ryabova's desperate signal, Popova pulled the release and dropped the bombs in haste. With the aircraft suddenly lighter, she wrenched the controls hard, trying to evade. Instead of the metallic ring of bullets striking aluminum, they heard the scream of canvas being ripped apart and the dull cracking of wooden struts splintering. Burning rounds pierced the aircraft with horrifying whistles. Fighting down her terror, Popova clenched her jaw and held the controls tight. The aircraft shook violently like a dead leaf caught in a storm. But somehow, the engine itself had been spared, and the plane remained in the air. At last, they slipped out of the searchlight's grip and escaped the flak. Popova, her hands trembling, managed to bring the aircraft down on the runway, back at base. When dawn came and the ground crew rushed over to inspect the plane, cries of horror broke out. Popova's Po-2 had been shredded like a sieve. The wings and fuselage were torn through and through. When they counted the holes punched into the airframe, there were 42 of them. Some wartime accounts say 47. By some miracle, the bullets had missed the most vital parts: the fuel tank and the engine block. But the most chilling trace of all was inside the cockpit, The map book spread open on Katya's knees had been pierced clean through the center by a heavy bullet and was left burned and ragged. Even more frightening, the top of Popova's thick leather flight helmet bore a visible tear where a bullet had grazed it. Had that trajectory been even 2 centimeters lower, both women would have been killed instantly. Looking from the 42 bullet holes in her aircraft to the hole torn in her own helmet, Popova tried to steady her trembling hands. Then, turning to Katya, who was still white with shock, she reportedly gave a crooked smile of relief and made a joke. The Po-2 that returned, riddled with holes, was never abandoned. The true greatness of the Night Witches lay not only in the brave pilots who flew the missions, but also in the sweat and devotion of the ground mechanics and armorers who stood firm in the mud and brought the aircraft back to life again and again. When the aircraft came back at dawn, battered and barely holding together, the young female mechanics waiting on the ground hurried to it at once with toolboxes in hand. If modern aircraft maintenance depended on precise metal welding and riveting, the maintenance of the wooden and fabric Po-2 looked more like surgery or giant sewing. When the pine frame had been splintered by flak, new wood was fitted in place and bound tightly with glue and wire. And what of the wings and fuselage, ripped open grotesquely by those 42 tracer rounds? The girls cut away the burned and torn sections neatly with knives, then placed patches of cloth or new pieces of kekanite fabric over the holes and stitched them by hand, one careful stitch at a time, with heavy thread and large needles. Even when their fingers, frozen in sub-zero weather, were pricked until blood welled up, the work did not stop. Once the stitching was finished, they painted the repaired surface with layer upon layer of a poisonous special coating called aerodope, which hardened the fabric and tightened it like a drum against air resistance. The stench of chemicals filled the barracks while it dried. And yet, in those appallingly harsh frontline conditions, the aircraft that had looked fit only for scrap were often fully repaired within half a day by those swollen, raw hands. Every hole sealed, every tear patched, they somehow returned to life. Then that very night, they rose once more into the darkness with bombs hanging beneath them. It was a heartbreaking struggle for survival, created together by the pilots, the aircraft, and the girls on the ground, whose hands froze while keeping them flying. In the summer of 1942, as German forces launched a major offensive into southern Soviet territory, Popova's women's bomber unit moved to a temporary airfield close to the front and continued flying nightly missions. It was during this period that her aircraft was damaged during an operation, and she was forced to make an emergency landing. While returning from a night bombing mission, Popova's light bomber came under German anti-aircraft fire at low altitude. She managed to land at a nearby airfield, but the impact left her injured as well. There she received treatment and assistance from a fighter unit stationed nearby. Among the pilots in that unit was a young officer named Semyon Ilyich Kharlamov. Kharlamov was a fighter pilot engaged in air combat against the German Luftwaffe. He first met Popova while helping the injured female pilots. According to Popova's own recollections, he was already an experienced aviator who had fought in many aerial battles, calm in manner and possessed of a quiet sense of humor. Their first meeting was brief. On the front, the next mission was always waiting. But the two left a strong impression on each other. Later, at different airfields and operational sectors, they crossed paths several more times while serving in separate units. Each time, they exchanged only a few words, but with each meeting, their connection deepened. War allowed no ordinary romance. Both of them flew almost every day, and either could vanish and never return. So their meetings were usually brief conversations beside the runway or short moments of rest between missions. Yet those very moments only brought them closer. Popova flew by night, bombing German positions. Kharlamov fought in the daylight sky against German fighters. They flew at different hours, but beneath the same war-torn sky, facing the same danger. That shared burden bound them together. Near the end of the war, both of them were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, under the same decree in February 1945 for their combat achievements. Then, after Germany's surrender in May 1945, they met again in Berlin and are said to have commemorated their reunion by leaving their names on the wall of the Reichstag. That reunion meant something profound to them. They had survived countless sorties and constant danger and found one another again. In the end, they married after the war and came to be known as a heroic Air Force couple who shared not only a life together, but the memories of war itself. Not everyone was as fortunate as Popova and Ryabova. For the Night Witches, each night's sortie was, in essence, an act carried out in the face of almost certain death. Their aircraft had not a single millimeter of armor. A tiny fragment from an exploding anti-aircraft shell could pierce a pilot's chest. When just one tracer bullet from a German fighter hit the highly flammable fabric coated in aerodope, the whole aircraft could burst into bright red flame, and the dark night sky itself would become their funeral pyre. In the early years of the war, when parachutes were often not properly issued, many female pilots and navigators vanished into the black sky in burning wooden aircraft, dying in agony without even the means to escape. Brilliant aviators such as Vera Balik and Yevdokia Nosal, one of the earliest female heroes, also gave their lives in the burning sky for their homeland. During the war, the 588th Regiment's extraordinary service was recognized, and in 1943 it was elevated to the elite status of the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. Yet that honor came at a cruel price. More than 30 precious members were killed. In the cold barracks after a night of flying, the sight of an empty military cot and a pair of worn boots left behind by someone who would never return again made the surviving women pull their blankets over themselves and cry in silence. But even grief was a luxury they could not afford. When darkness returned, they wiped their swollen eyes, put on their flight uniforms, and once again gripped the controls, heading back into a sky where death waited. From its creation in 1941 until the war's end over Berlin in 1945, the unit flew more than 23,000 night missions. From the Caucasus through East Prussia to the very borders of Nazi Germany's heartland, they carried out a miraculous number of operations. The total bomb tonnage they dropped from their wooden aircraft onto enemy positions exceeded 3,000 tons. The Witches blew up major bridges, destroyed critical ammunition depots, and crippled German supply lines so thoroughly that they weakened the enemy's capacity to wage war. In recognition of these overwhelming and decisive achievements, 23 of the regiment's members were awarded the Soviet Union's highest military distinction, Hero of the Soviet Union. Nadezhda Popova herself became one of the truest heroes of her homeland, flying an astonishing approximately 850 sorties. In May 1945, the Long War finally came to an end. When the mad thunder of artillery over Berlin finally fell silent, the broomstick-like sound that had once terrified German soldiers in the night sky also faded into history. In the joy of victory, the Night Witches unit was officially disbanded that autumn, leaving behind its dazzling achievements. The Witches took off their rough, blood-stained uniforms and scattered into ordinary life. Some continued flying as pilots for civilian airlines such as Aeroflot. Some became teachers. Others returned to work as laborers, wives, and mothers, carrying the scars of war quietly but stubbornly through the years of peace. Nadezhda Popova spent the rest of her life honoring and remembering the comrades with whom she had shared the cockpit of the worn-out Po-2 and faced death night after night. In 2013, at the proud age of 91, she passed away, closing the final chapter of a legend. In the Great Cold War swirl that followed the Second World War, and in a history of war long written through the lens of male-centered heroism, the achievements of these women were for many years left in dusty archives, barely illuminated. The old prejudice remained. How much could women really have contributed to war? But as time passed and the fragments of history were brought to light again, the fierce struggle of these women, who night after night plunged into the red jaws of death in the oldest plywood and the humblest canvas, was rediscovered. Their story rose again as a mythic legend that moved hearts around the world. A dark sky, a sharp sound cutting through the wind, an ungainly wooden aircraft. The Germans, overcome by fear, called them witches with contempt. But true history remembers them not as objects of terror, but as the bravest and most noble of aviators, guardians of the sky, and, in a sense, saviors. The 23,000 red trails they left behind are proof of how the human spirit can rise above mechanical limitations and the crushing terror of war. Their beautiful and desperate flights through the night remain one of the brightest constellations in military history, shining forever overhead. The sound of those old wooden aircraft that once cut through the night sky fell silent long ago. But the courage, love, and unbroken will to live that they left behind still breathe quietly within history, even now. War took countless things away, and yet, even within it, some people still found one another, protected one another, and endured an age together. The story of Nadezhda Popova and Semyon Kharlamov is therefore not merely one scene from war. It is a record proving that even in the darkest of eras, the human heart does not disappear. The night witches were called by a name born of fear, but history will remember them not as creatures of terror, but as the bravest aviators who defended the sky. Tonight, you have looked back together on the courage and sacrifice the night witches left behind, and on the love and dignity of human beings that did not disappear even beneath the darkest skies of war. The story of Nadezhda Popova and Semyon Kharlamov shows us that even when war seems to swallow everything whole, the human heart between one person and another does not always go out. Perhaps what allows history to endure is not only the record of victory, but the human will to protect and remember one another within it. This channel is an audiobook channel where I share little books I have made myself with all of you. Next time, I will return with another meaningful story that leaves a lasting echo in our daily lives. Thank you sincerely for being here with me. This was Sage, the cat author who delivers the world's knowledge through little books.